I'm going to review a book written by Mark Tully. The name of the book is UpCountry Tales, Once Upon a Time in the Heart of India. The first time Mark Tully dabbled in fiction was in the year 1995 when he wrote a book called In the Heart of India. I read that book in the year 2011, and when I read that book, the first thought which flashed through my head was that here is a journalist who can write fiction as well as non-fiction. He was the first journalist in India, to my mind, who could write both these genres with elan. But when I read this book, the previous book written by Mark Tully, and most probably the last book, because he makes it amply clear in the introduction itself that he was not keen on writing this book, but his publisher, he forced Mark Tully to write this book, saying that you have one last book in you. This book, to my mind, undoes Mark Tully's previous works. I have read almost all the books written by Mark Tully, be it on Indira Gandhi, be it on other social and political issues of India like No Full Stop in India, India Unbound, India in Slow Motion, or on Rajiv Gandhi like Rajiv Gandhi, 40 years since Elan. All those books were far different, too different from this book which I am going to review today. What is the problem with this book? This book is the second book where Mark Tully has dabbled in fiction. The first time, as I said earlier, was in 1995 when he wrote In the Heart of India. It's a collection of 7 short stories, and it has exactly the same theme which he addresses in his earlier books. All of Mark Tully's book, be it India in Slow Motion, be it No Full Stop in India, or Rajiv Gandhi, 40 years since Raj, or Amritsar, Mrs. Indira Gandhi's last battle. All these books have the theme of Indian politics and society. So this book in that sense is not different, or it does not break away from the past, what Tully writes in his earlier books. What is the problem with this book? The problem with this book is, the moment you start reading this book, you realize that here is a man who is not willing to write a book, but he has been forced to put his pen on paper. This book is, as I said, collection of 7 short stories. The first short story is about a Dalit man who has never stood up for himself in life. After death of his wife, he has been thrown out of his home by his sons, and he does not find a voice for himself. He cannot protest. A man who is supine in nature, a man who is not willing to find a spine, or I should say a man who has failed to find a spine in his life. The story is a very promising story. What is the problem? The problem is that Mark Tully never lets his character develop a personality. So this Dalit man, who is living on the outskirts of his village, all of a sudden finds himself in the tumult of his time. He finds his voice, but he never comes out as a hero. Here is a man who could have been a rebel. Here is a man who could have been a rebellious figure. Here is a character which could have been at a par with one of Premchand's character, Nirmala. But yet, Mark Tully deliberately or unwittingly does not let personality of his character develop. So you come across this Dalit man, whose name I don't remember, and it is not important. This man is trying to stand up for his biradari, his community, a Dalit. Now, in the village he is living, these Dalits are suppressed by so-called forward caste people who do not let these Dalits live a life of dignity. So what this man does is, he says that I am going to build a temple for my community, and the temple will be dedicated to Sant Ravi Das. Problems come, of course there will be problems, but problems, rather than being solved by the protagonist of the story, problems are solved on their own. Problems present themselves, and then quite hilariously, they solve themselves. So when there is a problem with police, the police either turns out to be benevolent, or if police does not turn out to be benevolent, then there is a politician from the upper caste who is willing to stand up to the Dalit community, for the Dalit community, because he wants to nurture his constituency, because he wants to nurture his vote bank. At the end of the story, you feel little deflated. You feel that here is a character who could have been a hero of the story, but yet the writer did not let his personality develop. So it's a very promising story which flounders and follows its place on its face, not because it has flaw, but rather the flaw of the writer. The second story has exactly the same problem. The second story is called Murder in Milanpur. Now, Murder in Milanpur is a very promising in the beginning. It could have turned out to be a very mysterious story. But what happens? It turns out to be a CID program. Those of you who have watched CID program on cine television will remember that something happens, a crime happens, a CID team comes, but CID team does not solve the problem. Somehow, by some quirk, some luck, the conspirator or the criminal is exposed, and the only thing that the CID team does is stand there, indulge in conjectures, and then say, oh, this guy must have done, and that guy miraculously appears on the crime scene and said, yes, I have done it. So this Murder in Milanpur, a very promising story in the very beginning, again just like the first story, fall on its face. Why? Because the writer, it seems, is not convinced that he could pull it off. On the very second page of this story, Murder in Milanpur, you will be able to guess who is the murderer. And once you are able to guess, then the entire joy of reading a story is gone and you are no longer interested. Third story is called The Plowman's Lament. The Plowman's Laments suffer from exactly the same problem as other two stories. What is the story in Plowman's Lament? I am not going to tell you the story because it will spoil your interest. If you are willing to buy this book, it will cost you 599 rupees. So I am not going to tell you the entire story, but here is the story of a Ahir, a Yadav, who owns a land, but then he gets himself in trouble, and rather than letting this man go through trials and tribulations of life and baptized in fire of life, what does writer do? The writer make two people appear in his life. One, his elder brother, who is a driver in Calcutta, a very benevolent brother, and second, a benevolent lawyer who solves problem on behalf of this defeated and dejected Ahir, plowman, a farmer. So the problem with this story is exactly the same problem in the earlier two stories. The character is not allowed to develop, the personality is not allowed to develop, problems present themselves, then problems solve themselves. Problems get solved not because of personality of the character, but because of certain circumstances, benevolence of other people in life. There is a wife who comes out as a woman who is highly insecure. She is more interested in cutting her husband down to size rather than standing with her husband during trials of life and coming out as a heroine. Fourth story, exactly the same problem. What is the name of the fourth story? The fourth story is the family business. When you go through this story, you will have a feeling that this story is directly or indirectly talking about Rahul Gandhi, but it is not, because all these stories are set in 1980s, pre-liberalization. But this book was written after 2015. You have this feeling that the boy who has returned from England with a D grade degree in a C grade subject from a B grade university, he behaves like Rahul Gandhi. So what does he do? He uses lot of buzzwords. Which are the buzzwords? Women empowerment, youth empowerment, youth here, development in villages, Panchayati Raj, and what happens at the end of the story? The man takes to heel because he is not able to nurture the constituency bequeathed to him by his father. But what is the problem with this story? The problem with this story is exactly the same problem with other three stories. The writer once again is the writer comes out as a writer who is not convinced that he could put his pen to paper and write a convincing story. This story could have been error of tragedy of errors, but at the end it fizzles out. It turns out as a comedy, not even comedy. It simply peters out the force of the story. What a story which could have been so powerful, a statement on dynastic politics, peters out the moment the boy runs away to Delhi, and we are not even told that what he is going to do with his life. Fourth story of this book is The Reluctant Lover. Now, the kind of rage that I felt when I read this story, The Reluctant Lover, I can't express in word. Why did I felt rage? Why did I feel rage? The reason I felt rage was because again Mark Tully has picked on the topic of Dalit issue, brilliant issue, an issue which should be close to everyone's heart. So here is a story of a boy who is bullied not only at home but also in his school. He is bullied by his parents as well as his teachers. As a result, he becomes a very anxious man in his life. Now, if Mark Tully had let this character develop to its full, then this boy would have been a hero. But what does Mark Tully do? He robs this man the dignity of standing on his own. So again, there is emergence of a benevolent factor. A teacher who is a Brahmin comes to this boy's life, teaches him self-respect, teaches him the importance of wide reading, and as a result the boy develops kind of confidence in his ability. He makes it to Delhi University, one of the best colleges of North Campus of Delhi University, graduates from that college with highest grade in his subject history. But what does he do? Because he is carrying anxiety from his earlier life, again when he could have been an inspiring hero of the story, he turns out to be a darpok, a coward. He is not even willing to reciprocate the love of a woman because he is anxious that this woman will not be able to accept that he is coming from such a background. When the woman who is from Calcutta, coming from a cosmopolitan society, says that what is the place I occupy in your scheme of things, he says that, well, we don't have a future together and you should forget me. And when she insists that I can live a life in village and you should include me in your life, he says quite surprisingly, and it stunned me, he says that my parent will not be able to accept you. Here is a boy who has been bullied by his parent. Here is a boy who has been bullied in the society. Here is a boy who comes out of all these tragedies, makes his presence felt in the society by graduating from the best university, one of the best universities. And when the moment comes to assert his personality, he surrenders and says, my parent will not be able to accept you and you will not be able to live with me. So this boy who could have been a hero comes out as a coward. And you are stunned by another aspect of this story. This boy is not even given the dignity of having aspiration in his life. So a boy who is graduating from Delhi University is not even willing to do something big in his life. What he is going to do? He is going to return to his village because he thinks that he is in debt to his society, but he doesn't dream big. He doesn't say, well, I will be an MLA. He doesn't say, well, I will be a Mukhia. He says, I don't know what I will do. Maybe I will be farmer just like my father, but I have to return to my society because I am in debt to my society. I have to fight casteism. This boggles your mind that why this boy who could have been a hero of this story. Why this story, which could have been a statement on Dalit empowerment, why this story is not allowed to develop on its own, and why does the writer chickens out of making a powerful statement. The sixth story is Slow Train to Satnagar. Now this story has exactly the same theme, the theme of corrupt politician and an NGO woman taking on the politician and the politician losing at the end and all those things. But the problem of this story, exactly the same. No language, no style, nothing new. A story develops on its own and then collapses on its own. The story is not allowed to stand on its feet. And again you come out with the impression that Mark Tully is putting pen to his paper because he has been asked by his publisher, not because he thought that he had a book inside him. So here is a man being compelled to write, and that's why he is writing. The last story is The Making of a Monk. Again it touches on the issue of Dalit empowerment. A boy who has been humiliated throughout his life, a boy he sacrifices so much for his society and family. At the end he adopts Buddhism inspired by Baba Sahib Ambedkar, and he tries to break away from the misery of his life because he says, I have had enough of all these nonsense. I want to have a life of peace. Good story, but again, what is the flaw? The flaw is that the hero of the story is not allowed development of his personality. The story doesn't have a character, and the story doesn't have a glue. It goes from one point to another, then comes back to the same point, and again you feel that the writer was not willing to write, but he was forced to write. What was my impression when I read this book? I'm going to say something very harsh. When I completed this book, the first thought which came to my mind was, did I overestimate Tully in my teenage? I read all Tully's book, almost all of his book. Two of his books, which I did not read, was on Christianity and Jesus, and these books are available nowhere, neither on Amazon or anywhere in bookstall. So these two books I have not been able to read, but other books which he wrote on Indian society, Indian politics, bureaucracy, I have read them all. And my impression in my early teenage was that here is a writer who is best suited, who is best qualified to tell the story of my society. But when I read this book, the thought which came to my mind was that maybe I overestimated this writer, and maybe this writer is not as good as I thought. What could be more worse for a writer than to undo himself by writing a book which he was not willing to write but wrote under pressure from his publisher? Thank you. Shubh Ratri.